It's the year 1348, and death has a smell. It creeps through the narrow, crooked alleys of Averleigh, a once cheerful market town in southern France. Now cloaked in silence and dread, bodies are carted past shuttered windows, doors marked with red crosses throb with a warning no one dares to ignore. The bells toll, always tolling, but here's what no one ever tells you about this chapter in history. When death came to town, it didn't knock at the doors of the filthy. It crept under the clean ones, the homes where someone had just drawn a steaming bath, where someone had dared to scrub themselves, bare their skin to warmth. To water, Lady Mira de Sarlat had everything a noble woman of her time could desire: velvet robes, tapestries from Milan, a small collection of books, and a room of her own. But as the shadow of the Black Death fell across the land, she did what she was taught was wise. She stopped bathing, not because she didn't want to. She longed for the comfort of warm water, the lavender petals she once floated in her tub, the simple joy of feeling truly clean. But fear runs deeper than desire, and in the world of 14th century Europe, fear said this: hot water opens your body to the air. The air carries death. Do not bathe. Imagine that. To be so afraid of illness, you'd rather wear your dirt-like armor than let water touch your skin. You see, we've been lied to by our modern instinct. We assume the past was simply dirty because people didn't know better. But the truth is much more haunting. They did know something. They had reasons. The problem was, those reasons were tragically wrong. Back then, cleanliness wasn't synonymous with godliness. It was a risk, a temptation, a portal. When you stepped into hot water, you weren't just washing your body, according to the logic of the age. You were weakening it, opening up invisible gateways through your skin where sickness could slither in. Doctors wrote solemn warnings, priests preached restraint, and across Europe, people wrapped themselves in wool and linen and went unbathed for months, sometimes years. Lady Mira, as elegant as she was cautious, became a creature of ritual. Every morning, she wiped her face with a cloth soaked in wine vinegar and rose water. She freshened her hands with sage and thyme. Her servants laid out new linen shifts, and every week, the old ones were boiled in fire-heated cauldrons behind the manor. Not because Myra was vain, but because she was terrified. The irony. Myra's village once had a bathhouse, modeled after Roman traditions, public, steamy, a place of relaxation and gossip. But when whispers of disease came, the bathhouse was shuttered. The baths became suspect. Nudity invited sin, and sin, of course, invited death. So, the village dried up. People stopped visiting each other. The laughter once echoing in the communal steam rooms turned to muttered prayers behind locked doors. The scent of rosemary no longer meant joy, it meant desperation. Lady Myra would stare at the copper tub in her chambers, dust gathering around its base, and remember the last time she had dared to bathe. It was weeks before the plague. She had soaked in a blend of warm milk and crushed lavender. That night, her cousin fell ill. Then, her cousin's husband. Within days, they were gone. The water, someone had whispered, it opened her soul. Let the sickness in. We shake our heads now at the ignorance. But if we're honest, truly honest, can we blame them? They were people like us, scared. Disparity, watching their loved ones disappear, and when they looked for patterns in the chaos, they found comfort in control. Avoid the bath, they thought. Stay dry, stay alive. This isn't just about hygiene, it's about how fear rewires belief. How even the most intimate rituals, washing, scrubbing, soaking, can become acts of rebellion or acts of surrender. But there's something even more shocking here. Something that should make you pause, because despite all their terror, despite all their rituals and refusal of water, it didn't work. The plague still came. It didn't care about your pores. It wasn't deterred by your dry linen. It was as if the universe was mocking them. The very thing they avoided, water, the symbol of life, was never the problem. And yet, the lie persisted, passed from one household to the next, from mothers to daughters, from priests to peasants. The idea that to be clean was to be vulnerable. So the medieval world lived in shadow, afraid not just of disease, but of the very thing that could have saved them. And Lady Myra, she survived the plague, but not her fears. For the rest of her life, she refused to bathe. Even when the danger passed, even when the church softened, even when her granddaughter, bold and defiant, poured a bath and said, "I want to feel new," Myra turned away, closed the door, and whispered, "Clean is a lie. It costs too much." History is full of these stories, not of monsters or heroes, but of terrified humans doing their best in the dark. And when we understand their fears, we don't just learn about them, we learn about ourselves. We think we're different, but are we? Before we continue into the world of medieval bathhouses, lice combs, scented sacks, and lavender-perfumed secrets, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support more stories like this, deep, real, and oddly human. And trust me, you'll want to follow this one all the way to the end. Now, before we move on, let's play a little game of Would You Survive? Here's your question. If you lived in the 14th century and were invited to a community bathhouse during a plague scare, would you, A, go anyway? It might be the last moment of peace you'll ever have. B, refuse even the idea of warm water. Feels like an open invitation to death. Drop your answer in the comments below, A or B. Let's see what kind of medieval soul you are. York, England. A sharp wind coils through the market stalls as the church bells toll prime. It's still early, the light not yet strong enough to cast clear shadows, but Tommy's is already working, dipping a linen shirt into a pot of pale ash. Water, steam curling around his calloused hands. He's not a nobleman. He doesn't own books, or land, or a copper bath, but Tommy's possesses something far more vital in this age: clean linen. And in the 14th century, that's not just clothing, it's a defense, a ritual, a silent rebellion against filth, disease, and death. Linen, for Tommy's, is more than fabric, it's memory. His mother stitched his first shirt by candlelight, whispering that a clean layer kept the body pure. She didn't mean holy, she meant safe. She'd seen what unwashed flesh could do, how it festered, how it invited boils and rot. She'd watched neighbors fall sick, their skin blistering, their bodies breaking down from the outside in, and so she taught Tommy's what all wise parents taught their children: the skin could not be trusted, but linen was loyal. Every morning he peels off yesterday's shift and inspects it in the dawn. A smudge of soot, a streak of dried sweat, sometimes a small blood stain from a pricked finger or a bite from a flea. He frowns, not with shame, but with concern. Dirt means risk, not just illness, but reputation. Because in medieval York, appearance is not vanity, it's survival. He has 3 shirts, one on his back, one drying by the hearth, and one folded in cedar shavings inside a wooden chest. These aren't just garments, they are currency, worth more than coin in certain trades. When he brings a fresh linen to the guild hall, he's treated with respect. That's a clean man, they say. He keeps his house right. But how do you keep your house clean when water is feared? When baths are rare and often risky? The answer is in the weave. The flax fibers, tightly spun, wick away sweat and oil. The cloth breathes, even when your skin cannot. And when the linen gets too soiled, it is boiled. Not gently rinsed boiled, sometimes with lye, sometimes with salt, sometimes with crushed bay leaves, and always with care. His wife Edith takes pride in this. She stirs the linen as it bubbles in the pot, humming to herself the song of her grandmother who lived through a fever that wiped out half her village. That grandmother had one surviving child and one belief: never trust a man whose linen turns gray. So Edith labors, She scrubs the collars with a river stone. She threads new ties when old ones fray. She mends holes with hands that shake from the cold. All because she knows that cloth is the barrier between their life and its undoing. And Tommy's, he doesn't take it for granted. Each time he pulls a shirt over his head, the sensation is sacred, cool, clean, protective. He feels like he's sealing his body inside a second skin, one smarter than his own. It is a strange kind of intimacy, this bond between man and cloth. He doesn't think of it as hygiene. That word doesn't exist for him. But he knows how to listen to the cloth's wear. Its changing weight, the way it clings when it's damp or stiffens when it's time for boiling again. He is a dyer by trade, which means he works in a world of color, but his personal linen, always left white. That's not just preference, that's status. In a society where grime is universal and water is dangerous, white linen is a declaration. I am clean, not by circumstance, but by choice. It says something louder than any sermon. It says, I protect myself. Sometimes, on market days, Tommy's sees travelers from distant towns. Some wear wool tunics blackened with smoke. Some wear rough-spun cotton, heavy with the stink of weeks on the road. And he wonders how they endure it, their chafing, the itching, the constant film of their own skin pressing back at them. And then he remembers what it means to not have linen, to be too poor or too unknowing to protect yourself that way. He remembers a friend from childhood who couldn't afford even one shirt. He remembers how that boy's skin cracked in the winter and festered in summer, how he coughed through his last weeks. No one knew what took him. Some blamed the bad wind, others blamed God. Tommy's blamed the absence of cloth. It's not about luxury, it's about armor, a quiet, woven shield in the evenings. Tommy's takes off his work shirt and folds it neatly. He doesn't throw it into a corner. He lays it across a stool, carefully, as if to say thank you. Because this shirt has kept him safe for another day. Edith comes in, places a warmed shift over his shoulders, and together they sit by the fire. They do not speak of the illness in the next parish. They do not speak of the merchant who died last week, or the bathhouse in London that was burned down after a priest accused it of heresy. They sit in silence, surrounded by steam and firelight, and linen. If you ask them what keeps them alive, they won't say prayers or potions. They'll say shirts. And in that, perhaps, there's something deeply human. We reach for what protects us, not always the most obvious thing, not always the most glamorous, but something we can hold. Something that holds us back. In Thomas's world, the body is vulnerable, water is suspect, but cloth is loyal. And in the quiet folds of white linen, survival is stitched. Before the whispers, before the shame, before the doors were sealed with wax and holy warnings, there was steam, sweet, fragrant steam, rising through wooden slats, curling into the open sky like incense. And in that vapor lived trust, the lavender. Steam wasn't just a bathhouse. It was a sanctuary, tucked into the heart of medieval Barcelona, surrounded by olive groves and rust-colored clay roofs. It pulsed with life. The walls were thick stone, soft with lichen. Inside, heat wrapped around your shoulders like a prayer. You entered not to wash away grime, but to return to something older than fear, warmth, community, ritual. Madame Sura presided over it all like a queen without a throne. Her hands bore the calluses of labor, but her voice carried like silk over water. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the stone benches, every favorite herb of her regulars. Lavender for the anxious, chamomile for the grieving, mint for those who wanted to feel new. For years, the lavender steam thrived, not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. There was no pretense. You came, you shed your layers, you sat with strangers who were no longer strangers when you left. Merchants, widows, monks, seamstresses, even knights with damp tunics clinging to tired muscles, they all came to soak, to sweat, to breathe, And in that melting of flesh and ego, something sacred occurred. The bathhouse was not a place of indulgence. It was confession by heat, forgiveness through water. Madame Sura never needed to ask questions. The bath did all the listening, but holiness, in any form, draws attention. And attention is a dangerous currency. At first, the church said nothing. They understood the function. Monasteries had their own washrooms. Even scripture allowed for cleansing, especially before feast days or sacraments. But as the Lavender steam grew more popular, as laughter and music began to filter out of its stone walls at twilight, eyes turned, eyes that belonged to bishops, to magistrates, to men who feared what they could not control. Because people weren't just washing away sweat, they were washing away isolation. Divides between class, gender, even faith blurred in the fog of that bathhouse. And to some, that looked like rebellion. It began with rumors that women went in alone and left smelling of roses and men, that unmarried boys lingered too long, that people touched in ways they should not. Madame Sura heard them. Of course she did. But she also saw truth: everyday bodies scarred by labor, hands shaking from cold, faces slack with exhaustion. And then, an hour later, after steam and silence, those same people rising taller, laughing, meeting each other's gaze again. Still, the stories grew louder. Then came the plague. It didn't start in Barcelona, but when it arrived without mercy. Bodies fell in markets, in alleyways, in ships that no longer carried spices, but despair. And when people looked for someone to blame, they remembered the warm, open doors of the lavender steam. Pores, whispered a priest, his eyes wide as he held a cloth to his mouth. Pores open in heat. The sickness enters through them. Sura closed for 3 days, lit candles, burned rosemary and myrrh. She prayed not for safety, but for strength. On the 4th day, she reopened. 3 women came, then a man with a twisted back, then 2 boys with hollow eyes. They came, despite the fear, because the bath was the only place where their bodies still felt like their own. But the pressure mounted. Letters from the magistrate, fines, threats, an anonymous note nailed to her door. You wash sinners, you invite death. Sura stood in silence that morning, her hand resting on the iron hinge. She remembered her mother, who'd bathed lepers in a river far to the east, who said, water sees no sin, only wounds. But the world outside her stone walls saw plenty. One winter night, a group of men arrived with torches, not an angry mob, but something worse, officials with seals and scrolls and laws. They did not yell, they did not threaten, they simply read aloud the new edict: all communal bathhouses to be shuttered until further notice. They gave her 2 days. On the last day, the steam rooms were full. No one spoke much. A merchant cried quietly into his palms. A woman hummed a lullaby to herself. A young knight with a bandaged leg stared at the ceiling as if trying to memorize it. Madame Sura served them one final round of herbal tea, her hands steady. She didn't beg, she didn't rage. She just watched as they lingered, then dressed, then walked out into a world colder than it had ever felt before. The next week, she sold the copper basins to a baker. He used them for dough. The fire pits became ovens. The scent of yeast replaced lavender. And yet, something lingered. Even years later, when children walked past the bakery, they sometimes whispered stories. That the tiles in the back room still sweated when it rained. That if you pressed your ear to the old stone wall, you could hear water sighing. That Madame Sura, now gray and quiet, still burned rosemary behind her counter, not for bread, but for memory. The truth is, the bathhouse didn't die because it was dangerous. It died because it was powerful. Because it dared to gather people not in fear, but in comfort, in communion, and perhaps that's the most dangerous thing of all. Before he even opens his chapel doors each morning, Father Edwin makes a ritual of lighting a sprig of dried juniper and waving it gently through the nave. Not for ceremony, not for piety, but because the smell outside has already crept through the cracks in the stone. And if there is one thing the streets of Bruges have mastered, it is the art of lingering filth. Bruges is a marvel, in many ways a tangle of commerce, stained glass, and wool merchants, but beneath its picturesque arches and crowded markets lies something more honest, the waste of an entire city, flowing without shame or sewer. It's not that people wanted to be unclean, they simply had nowhere for it to go. There were chamber pots, of course. Every home had one, even the smallest huts near the riverbanks. They were ceramic or wood, occasionally lined with linen for easier cleaning. But once full, what then? The answer was as old as the town. Open the window, shout a warning, and pour gardes l'eau. Watch the water. It echoed through streets at all hours, especially after meals. Mothers yelled it, with babies on their hips. Drunks slurred it late into the night. And when it was ignored, which it often was, someone got soaked. Father Edwin once saw a noblewoman's silk train ruined in one splash. He remembered how she stood there, frozen, her dignity unraveling thread by thread while her maid wept, and all he could think, absurdly, was, at least it wasn't his cassock. For those in castles, things were slightly more dignified. They had garderobe, small stone projections from high walls with open shafts that led straight to the moat or a pit below. The idea was simple. Gravity would do the rest. Some garderobes were beautifully built, tucked inside thick towers with carved seats and shuttered windows. But even then, the stench traveled. The poor had no such comforts. In the outlying fields beyond the city's edge, peasants dug shallow pits or squatted behind hedgerows. No walls, no seats, just exposed sky and humility. In winter, the cold bit. In summer, the flies swarmed. It was not shameful. It was survival. Cleaning afterward. Moss, if you were lucky. Cloth scraps, if you had them. Snow in winter. Straw in autumn. Many simply used their hands and rinsed in nearby streams. That was the compromise. Nature offered what it could, and the rest was invention. There were no soaps for such matters. No rolls of parchment or perfumed paper. Toilet hygiene, like much else in the medieval world, was raw, real, and remarkably communal. Father Edwin remembered the monastery he trained in, where 6 privies stood side by side with no dividers. You learned to empty your body in silence, beside brothers who prayed or sighed or sometimes wept. It was humbling and oddly comforting. The body, after all, has its needs, and to sit shoulder to shoulder in vulnerability was to be reminded of your own humanity. But in Bruges, the reminder came less gently. Waste management was left to pigs, rain, and hired workers, called gong farmers. They came at night, moving through alleys with buckets and long poles, scraping out cesspits, swearing softly to themselves. People avoided eye contact with them, but when they passed, doors closed more quickly. Mothers clutched children tighter. They were necessary and unwanted sometimes. Father Edwin stood at his chapel window and watched them, men with arms like tree trunks and eyes dulled by stench. They did what no one else would, and in return, they were paid enough to survive, but not enough to forget. The city did try. Ditches were dug to channel runoff. Wooden planks were placed over the worst mud. Town laws were passed to punish those who dumped waste too close to wells. But laws only matter when people believe in them. And most people believed only in convenience, so the streets remained half stone, half slurry. And the smell, it clung. When a merchant from Genoa visited last spring, he arrived at Edwin's chapel for confession with a scarf over his nose. "Do your sins smell so strong?" Edwin had asked with a smile. The man did not laugh. He said, "You are a holy man. How can you bear to breathe here?" And Edwin had no answer. because holiness was not measured in incense and candles. It was measured in how deeply you could serve, even when the air turned foul. Still, even Edwin had his limits. On feast days, he asked the children to scatter herbs, thyme, mint, lavender through the pews, not just for decoration, for distraction. When the wind blew wrong, even prayer felt tainted. Yet despite it all, there was a strange kind of peace in it too. The honesty of it. No pretenses, no perfume to hide the truth. Every man and woman, no matter their title, had to relieve themselves. Every belly that ate would empty. Every chamber pot would fill. It was democratic, in its own bleak way. There was beauty in the improvisation. Wooden benches with holes carved lovingly. Outhouses painted with flowers. Children giggling at the sound of a splash. Elders who told stories while waiting their turn in shared privies. Even shame, when shared widely enough, begins to feel like ritual. Father Edwin, for all his training in robes, was not immune. He had his own chamber pot, kept beneath his bed, emptied by his apprentice. He did not pretend it wasn't there. He simply blessed it each morning and moved on. Because life was messy. And faith true, faith didn't flinch from filth. And so the people of Bruges lived. They wiped with moss. They stepped around puddles. They whispered curses when carts splashed too close. And then they went back to work. To living, to loving. Because even in a city that stank, there was dignity. Not in the smell, but in enduring it. The comb, long strokes, patience, silence. The lice made a sound when caught, a soft snap, and Eleanor never flinched. Some cried, some begged for the shaving blade. Others just sat, resigned to the hour it would take. The nobles always asked for the back entrance. The priests offered confessions before they sat in the chair, but Eleanor held no judgment. She understood. In a world where washing was rare and privacy rarer, your hair told stories you couldn't hide. Infestation wasn't sin. It was consequence. Fashion didn't help. Courtly women wove ribbons into their braids, nested their curls in wire cages, powdered their locks with flour and ash. Wigs were passed down like heirlooms, heavy, elaborate, and teeming. Men curled their hair with hot irons, tied it back with silk bands, wore velvet caps for status and warmth. Every flourish, every bow, was an invitation. And so Eleanor worked. She designed combs with teeth so fine, they split eggs from shafts of hair. She soaked bandanas in vinegar and sage, then taught clients how to wrap them at night. She sold little pouches of thyme and rue to be sewn into collars. She didn't promise miracles, but she gave them moments, without itching, without shame. Her hands grew rough. Her back bent more each year, but her eyes remained soft. She saw beyond the bugs. She saw the women who wanted to feel beautiful again. The children too embarrassed to say anything until their scalps bled. The merchants who'd rather spend coin on appearance than truth, until the itching became unbearable. And sometimes, her comb found more than lice. A lock of hair falling out too easily, a scab that wouldn't heal, signs of illness no one wanted to name. She'd press her lips tight, then brew something extra for the road home. She never said what she feared. She just gave them balm and blessings. She had seen whole households fall to infestation, mattresses burned, bedding soaked in brine and smoke, hair cropped to the scalp. Sometimes it wasn't enough. The bugs returned, again and again, like a test of endurance. Eleanor herself was not immune. She wore her hair in a tight braid, washed weekly with vinegar, combed daily. But there were mornings she woke, scratching. Even healers were human, but unlike many, she didn't run from it. She faced it. Because beneath all the lace and linen, beneath the powdered cheeks and powdered wigs, medieval beauty was not about perfection. It was about resilience. To maintain any dignity amid the filth. To hold on to grace while creatures clung to your skin. That was beauty. A young noblewoman once came to her. cheeks flushed, hair wrapped in silk. She whispered, "My wedding is in 3 days. Please, fix me." Eleanor said nothing. She simply lit her candle, warmed the oil, and began. The girl left hours later, head sore but clean. Eleanor gave her a comb, carved with olive branches. "Use it," she said, "whether anyone sees or not." And when word came weeks later that the marriage had gone through, and the girl now wore her hair unbound with pride, Eleanor smiled. Not because she had saved her, but because she had reminded her of something worth holding on to. Infestation was reality. Beauty was choice. And in a city of masks and mirrors, Eleanor's little shop offered something rare: honesty. It came with oil and herbs, with combs and silence, and it was paid for not in gold, but in trust. She knew that no matter how elegant the hairstyle or expensive the wig, every head it touched was just as vulnerable, just as human, just as in need of care. And so, each morning, before she opened her shutters, she combed her own braid, slowly, reverently, because dignity starts with what you do when no one is watching. There are moments in life so fragile that they seem to hinge on the smallest detail. For Sir Bran of Lubeck, it was his breath. The year was 1379, and Bran, a young knight recently returned from a campaign in Flanders, had been invited to the household of a prominent merchant to dine with his daughter, Lady Ilsa. It was not yet a formal courtship, but in cities like Lubeck, where salt, silver, and silk passed through the harbor like tide's reputation weighed heavier than gold, and first impressions were rarely forgiven. He stood before a cracked mirror in his quarters, examining the line of his jaw, the set of his hair, and most urgently, the inside of his mouth. Bran had not eaten meat in 2 days, afraid of lingering odor. He'd chewed on fennel seeds until his tongue felt numb. His squire, always practicable, handed him a small flask of vinegar steeped with mint and sage. "This is what my grandmother used on feast days," the boy offered. "It stings, but it works." Bran took it and rinsed. The taste flooded his mouth, acid and green, not pleasant, but bracing. He spat into the fire and watched the flames hiss. Oral hygiene in the medieval world was a quiet kind of battle. There were no toothbrushes as we know them now, no daily routines carved into culture. Yet people still cared. They had to. One's breath, one's smile, one's teeth. They were often the first and only things someone noticed. And while Bran had never given it much thought and war, here, on the edge of a new life, he found himself desperate to appear decent, human, unoffensive. He had seen enough in the field soldiers, whose gums bled from rot, whose teeth blackened from poor rations, whose mouths reeked so foully that helmets became safer shut, and not just common men, nobles too. They died, as slowly and humiliatingly from dental pain as they did from wounds. But Lubeck was not a battlefield. It was a city of civility, and in cities, the rules were different. Merchants rinsed with wine to disguise sour breath. Some chewed cloves, others rubbed their teeth with linen cloths soaked in salt or vinegar. Bran's father had once scraped his molars with a twig from a hazel tree, fraying the edge like a brush. It worked well enough, until it didn't. Single quotes, there were those with perfect teeth, white and straight as carved ivory, but they were rare. Most people's teeth were crooked, stained from dark rye bread and salted fish. Pain came often, without warning, and when it did, there were few remedies. A rotten tooth meant extraction, by force, by hand, by the same barber who trimmed your beard and might have just finished bloodletting someone in the back room. So Bran had done what many did. He had prayed, and chewed on rosemary twigs, and avoided the sweet wines from the south. But now, on this night, he needed something more. He opened a small tin, a gift from a traveler he'd once rescued, a coarse powder of charcoal and powdered eggshell. He dipped his linen cloth into it and rubbed gently along his teeth. It was gritty, bitter, but when he rinsed again, the temps of vinegar returned, sharp and final. It was time. Lady Ilsa's home was lit with beeswax candles and filled with the scent of honey and baked apples. She greeted him with a practiced smile, but her eyes held curiosity, not judgment, that he could work with. He bowed, kissed her hand lightly and waited, and then she said it. "You smell like rosemary," she laughed, "and vinegar." My grandmother swore by both. Relief, so sudden and vast, nearly made him stumble. She wasn't put off. She was amused. They dined. They talked of ships, of trade, of stories from the roads between towns. And never once did she flinch when he leaned closer. Never once did her eyes dart toward his mouth with disapproval. It seemed such a small victory, but for Bran, it felt enormous. A confirmation that care mattered. That effort, no matter how crude or unscientific, could still bridge to lives. And, in the candlelight, he noticed that she too chewed fennel, that her teeth bore the faint grit of ash cleaning, that perhaps she had worried just as much as he had. Later that night, walking back beneath the stars, Bran felt no shame in the little rituals he had performed. There had been dignity in them, honor even, because in a time where decay lurked, in every crevice, where pain could erupt from the very place you spoke and smiled, tending to your mouth was an act of hope, of invitation. And maybe that's what courtship really was. Not a battle of status or wit, but of mutual vulnerability, of saying, without words, I cared enough to try. Bran would go on to see Lady Ilsa again, and one day, years later, when they were married and older and his hair had thinned and her hands had begun to tremble, she would still brew vinegar with mint, and he would still rinse every evening. Not for charm, but for tradition, for memory, because some acts, once born of necessity, become gestures of love. And long before modern dentistry, before toothpaste and brushes and enamel-strengthening formulas, all people had was intention, and in that, there was always something worth smiling for. In the labyrinthine alleys of medieval Alexandria, dawn arrives as a pale flame flickering across sandstone walls. A warm breeze drifts through spice markets and tapestry merchants. Beneath it all, a more subtle current courses through the city. For Averleigh, the perfumer, scent is power. Her shop opens to the narrow street like a secret portal. Shelves carved from cedar hold tiny glass flacons, each labeled in delicate ink, ambergris, civet, rose oil, frankincense. The counter is a mosaic of crushed petals, powdered musk, resin, vinegar, honey. Averleigh, standing behind it, is not just a merchant. She is an alchemist of identity. It began early for her, apprenticing under her mother, who taught that fragrance could shape how the world saw you. In Alexandria, where sewers drained into the harbor and camel caravans carried the sins of distant deserts, a clean scent was currency, not just for nobles or priests, but for anyone who wanted to move through crowds with dignity. Your scent precedes you, her mother used to say. Better it speaks of confidence than survival. Averleigh learned to craft variations, morning washes of citrus and mint to stir the senses awake, evening blends of rose and myrrh for reflection and repose. She mixed for merchants who needed trust, for scholars who needed clarity, for brides who needed devotion. Each creation was subtle, yet spoke volumes. Merchants were her most discerning clients. One came to her regularly, his textile shop next door. He insisted on a fresh blend each month, jasmine and violet for arrival, citrus and cedar for negotiation. My rivals know my cloth is fine, he said, but when they smell fresh linen and mountain blooms, I close the sale before they enter. Borrowers of comfort weren't limited to men. A widow oversized in black velvet came to Averleigh one afternoon, her eyes red from mourning. She wanted something that whispered hope. Averleigh blended rosewater with a hint of frankincense, dusted with lavender. The widow breathed it in, and wept quietly. She left the shop more upright than when she entered. Then there was the bishop who commissioned a scent, so subtle that none would notice unless he walked into a church. A lion gave him frankincense and myrrh, spiritual, respectful, authoritative. He carried it in his robes, and at court, she heard people say, "I can't see him, but I know the bishop is here." That was Senta's strategy. But the apex of her craft was the pomander, a hollow ball, curled with metal filigree, filled with dried herbs and essential oils. It hung from necklaces, girdles, belts. Nobles wore them like talismans, merchants like badges, children like charms. Some pomanders exhaled rosemary and thyme, others cinnamon and cloves. They were medieval air conditioners, portable, personal, poised. One of her favorite clients was Lady Mirabelle, a merchant's wife of some means. She came in every week, requesting fresh life, a pomander that changed with the day. Mornings of citrus and blossoming almond, afternoons of jasmine and rose, nights of sandalwood and amber. She wore them heavily at court and lightly in the home, changing scent like she changed her gown. Fragrance is freedom, she told a line, smoothing flower petals into her palm. When I wear something that suits, the world softens. But there was a darker side to this dance. Not everyone approved. Some accused perfumers of masking sign. Some priests warned that those who dabbled in strong scents were vain, aloof from spiritual humility. Others whispered of exotic substances civet from distant lands, ambergris from Wales as immoral indulgence. Still, a line persisted. One hot summer night, after a power outage, a group of magistrates burst into her shop. They tore open crates, smelled each vial, sniffed at pomanders. They accused her of perfuming away virtue, distracting men from prayers and women from purity. They were searching for scandal. A line stood still. She offered them tea brewed with rose petals, mint, and honey. Fragrance, she told them, does not corrupt. It comforts. It commands. A calm mind reasons better. A composed heart loves truer. The lead magistrate paused mid-inspection. He sniffed. Then he asked for a pomander for his wife. She crafted one that night, dried lavender, thyme, and a drop of rose oil. The magistrate left, mystery in his eyes. Rumor claims his wife's calm after that night saved one of her businesses from ruin. For a line, that was the essence of her work. Senta's social diplomacy, emotional armor, communal grace. Outside her shop, Alexandria breathed in fragmented odors: fish from the docks, sweat from laborers, dung from beasts. But stream past her door, and the world softened. You might smell incense drift from a temple. You might remember breath of sorrow, breath of joy. You might simply remember that you existed, because scent was more than cover. It was memory, mood, message, and none of that would matter if the perfume didn't speak your language. Each blend began with a question. A line asked her clients, "Who are you today? What do you wish to invite or repel?" Health, harmony, humility, power. From those whispers, she built layers: base notes of root and resin, heart notes of flowers, top notes that flickered like candlelight. She bottled not just oils, but intent. A fragrance for negotiation, one for mourning, one for celebration, one for love. Each formula hidden inside her heart, passed in loyalty from mother to daughter of her line, because the power of scent, she knew, was fragile. A pomander misplaced, a vial spilled, and the narrative cracked. But when right, it could transform the moment, shape interactions, move minds with nothing more than breath. In Alexandria, where culture collided and humanity converged, Aline's perfumes offered both shield and signature. They whispered class, they suggested confidence, they soothed sorrow, they sparked attraction. And when you walked past the harbor, when you boarded a ship for the Levant, when you stood beneath the arches of a mosque or church, you might not carry money, but if you carried fragrance, you carried story. And in that, perhaps lay true status, not in wealth nor titles, but in the air you left behind. Long before the sound of church bells, before cobbled streets and castle spires, before the Black Death carved silence into Europe's corners, there were cities, quiet, intelligent cities, built not around glory, but around water. They weren't the ones you saw in paintings or heard about in conquest tales. They lay beneath the skin of history, in layers of clay, stone, and forgotten ambition. Cities that breathed not through battlements, but through drains. Cities where the most sacred structures weren't churches but sewers. And one of those cities was Babylon. Marus was only 16 when he first ran his fingers along the edge of a water channel carved into the temple floor. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't glorious. It was simply there, reliable, hidden, uncelebrated. He had grown up surrounded by ziggurats, golden idols, and tales of kings. But none of that impressed him like the logic of a well-dug trench. He under a city engineer, whose name no one remembered, but whose work fed thousands. Together they mapped tunnels and wells, gutters and cesspits. They built not monuments, but systems. They didn't call it hygiene. They called it survival. Babylon, Teotihuacan, Mohenjo-Daro, names scattered across continents, cultures, and centuries, all had one thing in common. They didn't treat sanitation as luxury. They treated it as foundation. In Mohenjo-Daro, homes had private bathing areas, stone-floored and sloped for drainage, wastewater channeled into a covered sewer system, toilets flushed with pitchers of water. Not even Rome, centuries later, would match its consistency of civic cleanliness. In ancient Mexico's Teotihuacan, homes and temple complexes were threaded with canals beneath the floor drains that whispered under thresholds, weaving from room to street to field. People walked above, never seeing them, but they felt their effect. Clean courtyards, flowing water, fewer flies. Marus learned early what this meant, that a city's soul wasn't in its monuments, it was in its maintenance. But maintenance had no statues, no poems. He would spend hours sketching on wax tablets curves of aqueducts, slopes of drains, angles that ensured water moved forward, never back. And at night, when the city grew still, he would walk its length barefoot, listening to the quiet splash beneath his feet, the music of health. His teacher once told him, "You'll never be thanked for a sewer that works, only blamed for one that doesn't." And Marus understood. That was the price of invisible genius. Cities that respected hygiene did not do so for aesthetics. They did so because they had seen what happened when waste sat still. The stench wasn't just offensive, it was fatal. Even in Alexandria, where a line bottled scent to mask decay. It was the underground cisterns and storm drains that allowed her perfumes to float on air rather than sink into rot. The most beautiful things required infrastructure, but history doesn't remember engineers like Marus. It remembers emperors who tore down temples and generals who spilled blood on stone. Yet without those drains, those aqueducts, those underground breaths of the city, none of it could stand. In the ruins of Babylon, archaeologists found bricks with not just names of kings but marks etched by workmen who laid sewer tiles. Their signatures weren't declarations, they were prayers. Let this flow, let it hold, let it carry filth far away from us. Marus would have smiled at that. He believed in magic, not the kind sung by priests, but the kind built with slope and gravity. Once, when a festival overflowed the streets with thousands of sandals and shouting, his drainage tunnel held. The waste flowed away unseen, unnoticed, and a priest, unaware of Marus' work, thanked the gods for their mercy. Marus only nodded, because that was the contract of sanitation, to be invisible when successful. But nothing shaped the city more profoundly. In time, when Marus grew old, he designed a final project, a ring of channels that encircled the market district. They called it the Whisper Line, because it allowed people to shop without the smell of the tannery or the butcher shops. Number? One never saw it, but every merchant who sold lavender, grain, silk, or figs benefited from it. And when Marouz died, there was no statue, just a letter left on a wax tablet, gifted to his apprentice. If you love a city, do not carve its name in marble. Let it breathe, let it drain. In the centuries that followed, much of his work was buried. Wars came, cities fell, drains collapsed, and people forgot that before battles, before borders came water and waste, and where it went. But the lesson remains. True power lies not in what you build to be seen, but in what you build to be lived with. A city is not a crown of towers. It is a skin, constantly flushing, sweating, cleansing, breathing. And the greatest minds of ancient times didn't just sculpt gods, they sculpted flow. So next time you pass beneath arches or walk across cobblestones, listen. Below you, 1,000 years ago, someone like Marouz built a trench so you wouldn't step in filth. Someone who never asked to be remembered, only to be useful. And maybe that is the most sacred work of all. In a time when most rulers carved their legacy in blood and fire, Hadrian chose stone and silence. His palace, perched on the cliffs of Tarragona, didn't roar with the noise of conquest. It whispered with running water. Courtyards bloomed not with flags, but with fountains. The air smelled not of iron, but of lemon balm and olive wood. And at the center of it all stood the philosopher King Hadrian, draped not in armor, but in linen robes, always crisp, always clean. He wasn't born to the throne. He earned it through diplomacy, scholarship, and an uncanny gift for seeing connections where others saw chaos. He believed that the way a city was built reflected the way its people thought. And the first thing he thought a city needed before libraries, before markets, before towers was a wash basin. It is not weakness to want cleanliness, he once said to his council. It is civilization. To some, this was strange, unsettling, even. In a world where rulers bathed in riches and crushed dissent beneath stained boots, Hadrian's obsession with hygiene seemed out of place. But he saw no contradiction. He believed that philosophy without cleanliness was hypocrisy, that minds clouded by filth could not produce clarity. He ordered every public building in Tarragona to include a washroom not just for nobles, but for all. Simple basins, clay or copper, always filled, always flowing. Water drawn from aqueducts, he'd repaired himself. His scribes recorded letters, written not from war tents, but from bathhouses, where steam softened the lines of his thoughts. And yet, Hadrian was no ascetic. He was not removed. He met daily with his people, walking among scholars, artisans, dock workers. He asked questions. He touched what was broken, and when he returned to his study each night, he washed meticulously, silently as though each cleansing returned his mind to stillness. His closest companion was Antipas, a former architect who had lost his fortune in a collapsed tower project. Hadrian hired him not out of pity, but out of fascination. Antipas believed that beauty could be functional, that hygiene and harmony were the same, together. They redesigned neighborhoods, added drainage channels beneath the streets, rain-catching tiles atop roofs, shaded rest stops where basins flowed, beneath carved marble lions. Hadrian insisted that even the poorest districts should smell of stone, not sewage, that every child should grow up knowing the sound of clean water. It was radical, it was beautiful, and not everyone approved. Foreign rulers mocked him. Enemies whispered that he was soft, that no king who ordered daily linen changes could lead armies. But they underestimated what discipline it took to maintain peace in a world that glorified war. And when a smallpox epidemic swept through the southern ports, it was Hadrian's waterworks that saved thousands. His public basins became points of refuge, his bathhouses, sites of healing. Even his harshest critics could not deny the precision of his vision. Hadrian's court became known not for excess, but for elegance. Scholars recited verses while washing their hands. Soldiers sharpened swords beside fountains. Children played beneath arches designed to catch wind and cleanse air. But Hadrian was not immortal. He aged slowly, gracefully, but illness eventually touched even him. And in his final days, when breath came hard and words fell like stones, he made one last request, that his writings be inscribed not in gold, but in stone beside public fountains. Not to honor him, but to remind, let water cleanse the hand and the mind. One carving reads beneath an archway still standing. Antirus, now aged and bent, carried out the work. He oversaw each carving, each basin, each tile, and when the last was finished, he placed a single rose into Hadrian's favorite washbowl, a simple clay vessel, chipped at the edge, still cool from mountain water. Hadrian had no grand tomb. He did not want one. He believed legacy should live not above ground, but beneath hands, in the quiet rituals, in the daily gestures that shaped the soul of a city today. Few know his name. His empire, like many, was swallowed by time, but in certain towns, in tucked-away plazas and alleyways, you can still hear water trickle where it shouldn't. A basin built too beautifully to be practical, a drain carved like poetry. That was Hadrian, a ruler who believed that power without peace was just noise. That true leadership began with a clean hand, a clear mind, and the wisdom to know when both needed washing. And maybe the next time you turn on a faucet or rinse your face in a quiet moment, you'll feel the faint echo of that whisper, not a command, a suggestion that in every age, to cleanse is to care, and to care is to reign. After centuries, the sands of time erase many records. But the lessons from Hadrian of Tarragona, Maruz of Babylon, Aline of Alexandria, Eleanor of Venice, Bran of Lubeck, and Tomies of York still hum beneath the city stones. They remind us that true dignity, true humanity isn't always found in grandeur, but often in the small, daily acts of care that connect us to each other and to our better selves. Hadrian's reign was defined not by conquests, but by canals, basins, and a persistent belief that true power respects the body, the community, and the dignity of everyday life. He taught that water isn't just for washing, it's for thinking, healing, and humanizing. When a king insists on daily basins for every citizen, not as a luxury, but a right, he shifts civilization's baseline from domination to decency. Maruz taught humility in his solitude. The city's soul is not in its courtyards, but in its unseen drains. No one praised him, but millions benefited. His work reminds us that the greatest impact is often invisible, carried not in acclaim, but in reliability. There's unparalleled grace in building something meant to last not for glory, but for good. A line, twisting aromas into purpose, showed that scent is rhetoric. It communicates without words. She gave confidence and kindness in bottled form, weaving empathy into commerce. Her craft teaches us that our aura, literally, what we carry in the air around us, matters. It speaks of respect and intention before we utter a single word. Eleanor combed lice from braids to offer dignity back to people who felt shame in their own skin. Her work was practical, yet her impact was profound. She was a quiet healer whose empathy shaped the way people looked at themselves and each other. Every stroke of her fine comb told a story of restoration, not denial. Bran battled more than war wounds, he battled social fear. A knight unsure of his place learned that grooming isn't superficial. It's an act of hope, readiness, and self-regard. It's not just appearance, it's armor. His transformation from battlefield to bridal ballroom proved that every human seeks permission to be seen as worthy, not just in body, but in spirit. Tomies, holding linen shirts across generations, showed that modesty can be revolutionary. He didn't seek praise. He simply respected his body, his family, and his neighbors through laundry. His dedication made routine an act of rebellion against disease and despair. He taught us that small acts of care like changing a shirt can echo across time and down streets, inviting community, trust, and resilience. Together, their stories form mosaic patterns across time, geography, and language, all built on the same frame. Bodies need tending, and when care meets utility, humanity flourishes. Bathhouses, combs, basins, and baselines, they are not relics of sanitary history. They are responses to the elemental questions of life. How do we respect ourselves? How do we respect one another? What threads do we tie between survival and dignity? It's no modern notion that hygiene matters, but their context transforms the concept into something rich with meaning. Think of the modern world, our hands mostly clean, our homes with running water, our electronic reminders to brush and bathe. We see hygiene as convenience, not triumph. But what if we remembered that today's convenience was yesterday's conquest? That every faucet, every sink, every soap bottle stands on centuries of risk, resistance, and human effort. All 6 figures carried a quiet call. Care matters, not because it dares to oppose death, but because it dignifies life. A lesson for today: daily care is civic action. Small acts like washing your hands, brushing your teeth, washing your clothes, they're not chores, they're civic care. They preserve health and community. They whisper, every day, I value life, I care for us. They keep the body as an instrument of thought, not just consumption. Invisible effort sustains us all. Recognize those who do the unseen work: plumbers, janitors, engineers, laundresses, caregivers. They are modern-day mattresses. Their work isn't glamorous, but it's essential. Honor the mundane. Elevate the silent heroes of sanitation. Ritual equals mindfulness. Hayden bathed, Eleanor combed, Bran rinsed. Tommy's iron debt in each ritual was care, respect, presence. We rush past hygiene: quick showers, fast laundry. What if we lingered? Could washing dishes slowly become meditation? Brushing your hair moment to ground yourself? Empathy is personal, yet shared. Aline's perfumes, Eleanor's combs, they were small tools of empathy that softened shame. A kind word about someone's appearance, a discreet compliment, a moment of warmth. We carry shards of shame with us. We can ease them with kindness in everyday interactions. No soap needed. Leadership loves clean lines. Our world brims with grand ambitions. Skyscrapers, Nobel Prizes, multi-billion-dollar tech. But leadership grew. Leadership operates on an invisible scaffold. Clear communication, consistent care, systems that flow. Leaders who invest in infrastructure of roads, education, sanitation, are the Hayden equivalents of today. Their legacy may not come on coins, but on well-lived lives. Your story, your clean line. What small act of care connects you today to this legacy? Did one of these stories stir something in you? Maybe you'll pause longer between brushing your teeth in the morning. Moment of gratitude for your teeth. Maybe you'll notice who refills the soap dispenser at work. Maybe you'll take to gently folding your towel instead of tossing it. Maybe you'll compliment someone's neat appearance, or bring freshly laundered clothes to a friend in need. These acts aren't about perfection, they're about intention. Every drop of water made the city livable. Every garment kept someone safe. Every comb restored dignity. These 6 lives remind us a clean line between survival and dignity is drawn, one drop, one thread, one kind word at a time. Let's talk. What do you think? What resonated most with you? Did a particular story hit closer to home? Do you have a modern habit or ritual? A mindset born out of care or routine that makes your day better or your world kinder? I'd love to hear your take. Share your thoughts in the comments so we can learn from each other's experience and build a community that values dignity and intention today, not just storied yesterdays. This journey through hygiene, humanity, and history inspired or surprised you. Hit that subscribe button Every new subscriber helps me create more thoughtful content, more deep dives, and more stories that connect the past to our lives now. Thanks for traveling this path with me, and let's keep walking it together.